Are you crazy, girl, or are you blind? You're trying to stain a suit you couldn't afford in your wildest dreams. The words didn't echo because the room was loud. They echoed because everything else was
Are
silent.
you crazy, girl?
Crystal glasses hovered midair. Forks paused inches from porcelain plates. Around the table sat men who moved markets with a phone call, and yet not one of them spoke. Because when a billionaire CEO explodes in public, you don't interrupt, you watch. The waitress stood frozen, a wine glass trembling slightly in her hand. Red wine spread slowly across the white tablecloth like a stain no apology could erase. Jonathan Prescott didn't notice the cameras, didn't notice the investors exchanging looks, didn't notice the deal slipping through his fingers. All he saw was a woman he believed was beneath him. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that this dinner was never just about contracts or numbers. It was a test, a quiet one, a human one. And in less than 30 seconds, Prescott had already failed. This isn't just a story about a billionaire losing money. It's about how power reveals who you really are and how fast everything can disappear when the wrong people are watching. If you've ever watched someone abuse power and wondered when karma would finally catch up, hit like, subscribe, and stay with me. This story proves that one moment can change everything. The ballroom looked like money. Not flashy money. Not loud money. This was the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. The kind that spoke in lowered voices, tailored suits, and crystal glasses that never clinked too loudly. White linen draped over round tables like fresh snow. Soft amber lighting glowed from chandeliers high above, reflecting off polished silverware and flawless porcelain plates. A string quartet played something elegant and forgettable, the kind of music designed not to be heard, only felt. This was where decisions were made, not the kind that made headlines immediately, but the kind that decided who would still exist in 6 months and who would quietly disappear. At the center of it all sat Jonathan Prescott. He didn't lean back in his chair. He leaned forward, elbows just close enough to the table to signal confidence without desperation. His navy suit was custom-tailored, the fabric smooth, expensive, unwrinkled, designed to survive scrutiny. The cufflinks on his wrists were subtle, platinum with a single dark stone, not loud, intentional. Jonathan Prescott was a billionaire because he understood appearances. Across from him sat the investors, men and women who smiled politely while calculating quietly. They nodded when he spoke, laughed at the right moments, asked questions that sounded friendly but were sharpened like knives. Everyone at the table knew the number, $800 million. That was what tonight was about. The deal had been negotiated for months. Lawyers had bled ink over contracts. Analysts had tortured spreadsheets until they confessed only optimism. The numbers worked. The projections were clean. The technology was sound. All that was left was this dinner. A formality, some called it. A test, others knew better. Jonathan lifted his glass, swirling the red wine slowly, watching it cling to the sides. "We're not just building a company," he was saying, voice smooth, practiced. "We're building a platform that defines the next decade." A few nods, a murmured approval. This was his element. What Jonathan didn't see, or didn't care to see, were the people moving quietly around in the edges of the room. The servers, the waitstaff, the ones trained to appear and disappear without leaving a ripple. To Jonathan, they were furniture that moved. And that's where Maya Thompson came in. She stood just a few steps away from the head table, posture straight, shoulders relaxed, hands steady around the stem of a wine glass. Her uniform was immaculate, a deep red dress with a white scarf tied neatly at her neck. Her hair was pulled back into a low, elegant bun. No loose strands, no distractions. She looked calm, but calm didn't mean unaware. Maya had learned how to read rooms like this long before tonight. She could feel the tension under the surface, The way conversations dipped when certain people spoke. The way eyes lingered on power and slid past showing service. She noticed who said thank you and who never made eye contact at all. Jonathan Prescott had never once looked at her. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was why she was here. Maya adjusted her grip on the wine bottle as she approached the table. She had served hundreds of dinners, thousands of guests. Her movements were automatic, precise, efficient, professional. Pour, step back, observe, repeat. She reached Jonathan's glass last. The chair beside him shifted suddenly. A guest leaned back mid-laugh. The movement was small, unintentional. Enough. The bottle tilted a fraction too far. Red wine spilled. Not a flood, not a disaster, just enough to streak across the white tablecloth, dark and unmistakable, creeping toward the edge near Jonathan's sleeve. Time slowed. Maya's breath caught, but her hands didn't freeze. She reacted instantly, setting the bottle down, reaching for a cloth. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said, voice low, steady. "Let me—" Jonathan exploded. "Are you crazy, girl?" he shouted, his voice cutting through the room like shattered glass. "Or are you blind?" Every conversation stopped. Maya froze, not because she was afraid, but because she understood something had just shifted. Jonathan rose halfway from his chair, face flushed with rage. He gestured sharply at the stain as if it were an insult rather than an accident. "You're trying to stain a suit you couldn't afford in your wildest dreams." Silence fell heavy and immediate. Forks hovered midair. Glasses stopped halfway to May. Lips. The quartet faltered, then fell quiet. Around the room, phones tilted. Subtly, instinctively. Maya felt every eye on her. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there, cloth in hand, her expression composed, unreadable. Inside, something hardened. Jonathan didn't notice. He was too busy asserting himself, too busy performing power. To him, this was correction, control, a reminder of who mattered and who didn't. But what Jonathan Prescott failed to understand, what he couldn't possibly understand, was that this dinner was never just about wine or suits or numbers. This room wasn't just watching him sell a company, it was watching him reveal who he really was. And in the quiet that followed his outburst, something far more dangerous than spilled wine began to spread, not across the table, across his future. Maya Thompson had learned something early in life. People reveal themselves fastest when they think you don't matter. That lesson didn't come from books or mentors. It came from grocery store aisles where cashiers spoke past her, not to her. From offices where her name badge earned silence. From rooms like this one, where power sat at the table and dignity moved quietly around it. She stood perfectly still as Jonathan Prescott's words settled into the room like smoke. Crazy, blind, too poor to understand what she'd touched. The insult wasn't new. The volume was. Maya lowered her eyes, not in shame, but in control. She had learned long ago that reactions were currency, and tonight she couldn't afford to spend any. She stepped back exactly one pace, the way she'd been trained. The cloth in her hand never trembled. Her breathing slowed. Her face remained calm. Around her, the room tried to recover. Someone cleared their throat. Another guest forced a laugh that didn't land. A woman near the far end of the table glanced down at her phone, then quickly turned the screen face down, as if embarrassed by what she'd just recorded. Jonathan Prescott sat back down, satisfied. In his mind, the moment was over, corrected, contained. That was his mistake. Because while Jonathan believed power was about dominance, Maya knew it was about observation. And she was observing everything. She noticed the investor 2 seats away from Prescott, whose jaw tightened, just briefly. She noticed the man across the table who didn't laugh this time. She noticed the way one executive shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking between Jonathan and the stain on the tablecloth like he was calculating damage. Most of all, she noticed the silence. Silence told the truth faster than words ever could. Maya turned and walked away from the table, heels quiet against the polished floor. To anyone watching casually, she was just another waitress moving on to the next task. But inside her pocket, her phone vibrated once. That was all. No message, no call, just a single vibration, confirmation. She moved toward the service corridor, her pace unhurried, her posture unchanged. Cameras didn't follow her there. They never did. Behind the closed doors, the noise of the ballroom dulled into a distant hum. The scent of wine and money faded, replaced by stainless steel and soap. Maya stopped. For the first time since the spill, she let herself exhale. Not because she was shaken, but because the hardest part was over. People assumed this job was beneath her. They assumed the uniform meant desperation, that serving meant surviving, that silence meant submission. They were wrong on all counts. Maya wasn't here because she needed the money. She was here because she needed the truth. 6 months earlier, she'd been sitting in a glass-walled office on the 43rd floor of a downtown building, listening as a consultant explained the assignment. Most executives know how to behave when they're being watched, the woman had said. They rehearse humility, they perform respect, but that's not who they are under pressure. Maya remembered nodding, hands folded in her lap. We don't test leaders with interviews anymore, the consultant continued. We test them with proximity, with inconvenience, with people they believe have no power. That was when they'd slid the folder across the table. Jonathan Prescott's name was on the front. Maya hadn't reacted then either, because she understood what was being asked of her. Observe, document, don't interfere, and above all, don't be seen. Back in the ballroom, Jonathan Prescott was still talking. He leaned forward again, recovering his rhythm, launching back into projections and market dominance like nothing had happened. He spoke louder now, sharper, as if volume could erase memory. But the room had changed. The stain on the tablecloth remained. So did the recording devices. Maya returned with a tray of fresh glasses, her expression neutral, her movements precise. She approached another table, first, then another. She didn't rush. She didn't avoid Jonathan's table either. She simply followed protocol. As she passed close enough to hear him, she caught fragments of his voice. People get too sensitive these days. Can't even correct staff without drama. Maya kept walking, because this wasn't about correcting staff. This was about character, and character, once revealed, couldn't be put back into the bottle. Her phone vibrated again, twice this time. She didn't check it. She didn't need to. The evaluation was unfolding exactly as designed. Jonathan Prescott believed the danger had passed. He believed the moment belonged to him. He didn't know that somewhere, not far from this room, a report was already being drafted, time-stamped, documented, verified. And he certainly didn't know that the deal he thought was secure was now balanced on something far more fragile than stock prices or contracts. It was balanced on who he'd just shown himself to be. Maya set down the tray, adjusted her scarf, and turned back toward the ballroom. The test wasn't over. It was just beginning. Jonathan Prescott told himself the moment was finished. That was how he survived situations like this, by deciding they were over before anyone else could disagree. He straightened his jacket, adjusted his cufflinks, and leaned back into his chair as if the interruption had been nothing more than a fly buzzing too close to his ear. A distraction, an annoyance, handled. He didn't look at the tablecloth again, but the stain was still there, dark, spreading slowly, impossible to ignore. A silent witness to something he couldn't erase. Anyway, Jonathan said, his voice louder than before, smooth but sharpened with irritation. As I was saying, market expansion is about aggression. If you hesitate, you lose. A few people nodded, others didn't. The rhythm of the room struggled to recover. Conversations resumed in pieces like a song trying to find its tempo after the beat dropped out. Someone laughed too late. Someone else lifted a glass and set it back down without drinking. Jonathan noticed none of it. He was already back in performance mode, stacking words like bricks, building the illusion that nothing had cracked. Across the table, one of the senior investors watched him carefully, not the way people watch speakers, but the way surgeons watch hands, looking for tremors, tension, tells. Jonathan smiled at the investor, mistaking the attention for admiration. "Let's be honest," Jonathan continued. "Leadership isn't about being liked. It's about results." The investor didn't respond. He simply took a slow sip of water and placed the glass down again. Behind Jonathan, Maya moved quietly between tables. She carried a tray now, fresh plates, polished silverware, folded napkins. Her steps were measured, her expression neutral. If anyone looked at her, they saw what they expected to see, a waitress returning to work after being put in her place. What they didn't see was the shift, because something had changed the moment Jonathan raised his voice. Maya felt it in the air. Not tension, clarity. People weren't wondering if what they'd heard was wrong. They were wondering what it would cost. She passed a table near the wall and caught a whispered exchange. "Did you hear that?" Every word. Another table, another murmur. "That was unnecessary. Phones are already out." Maya didn't slow, didn't turn her head. She wasn't here to react. She was here to record. Jonathan finished his point and waited for affirmation. When it didn't come fast enough, he laughed lightly, the sound edged with impatience. "Look," he said, spreading his hands, "you don't get to the top by worrying about every little thing." Little thing. The phrase landed wrong. One of the investors leaned back, folding his arms. Another checked her phone, her thumb, hovering over the screen longer than necessary. Jonathan noticed that. He frowned slightly, irritation flickering across his face. "Is there a problem?" "No," someone said quickly, too quickly. "Of course not." Jonathan nodded, satisfied, and launched into numbers again. Growth curves, timelines, projections that climbed neatly upward, untouched by reality. But numbers couldn't cover what had already been seen. At the edge of the room, near the service entrance, a hotel manager stood stiffly, eyes darting between Jonathan's table and the waitstaff. He knew how these nights worked. He knew how fast things could unravel. He also knew when not to interfere. Maya approached Jonathan's table again, this time with a fresh glass of water. She moved deliberately, placing it just within reach. Jonathan glanced at her, really glanced this time. His eyes hardened. "Be careful," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough to be heard. "You've already caused enough trouble tonight." Maya met his gaze, just for a second. Her eyes weren't angry. They weren't scared. They were steady. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. She stepped away. That was when the investor beside Jonathan looked up sharply. He'd noticed the tone, the repeat, the pattern. He didn't say anything yet, but his jaw tightened and he reached for his phone, not to record but to read. Jonathan missed that too. He was too busy regaining control, convincing himself and everyone else that he was still the most important person in the room. But power has a strange way of shifting when you're not looking. Across the ballroom, a discreet vibration passed through more than one device, silent alerts, quiet confirmations, information moving faster than conversation ever could. Jonathan felt the mood change again, sharper this time. "Is everyone still with me?" he asked, forcing a smile. The answer came back uneven. A nod here, a glance away there, a silence where applause should have been. For the first time that night, doubt crept in. Jonathan leaned back, eyes scanning the table, searching for reassurance. He didn't find it. What he found instead was distance. And as dessert menus were quietly placed at the edges of the table, Jonathan Prescott had no idea that the decision he feared most had already begun forming, without him, without his permission, and without any intention of being negotiated. The wine stain remained, and so did the consequences. By the time dessert menus appeared, the room no longer belonged to Jonathan Prescott. It took him a few minutes to realize it. Power doesn't disappear all at once. It drains quietly, like water slipping through a crack you didn't notice until the floor is already wet. Jonathan glanced around the table, expecting engagement. Instead, he saw restraint. One investor hadn't touched his stake. Another had pushed her plate aside entirely. A third kept checking his phone, the screen lighting. His face every few seconds before he dimmed it again, jaw tight. Jonathan cleared his throat. "I think we can all agree," he said, smiling too deliberately now, "that tonight confirms we're aligned." The word aligned hung in the air. No one echoed it. At the far end of the table, a senior partner leaned toward the person beside him. Not whispering, not hiding it. Just enough movement to signal something private was happening in plain sight. Jonathan felt it then. That subtle shift when a room stops orbiting you. Maya stood near the service station, her back straight, hands folded lightly in front of her. From here, she could see everything. The angles, the faces, the posture changes that told a story long before words did. This was the phase most people missed. They thought consequences came with shouting, with announcements, with slammed doors. They didn't. They came with quiet coordination. She watched one investor excuse himself, murmuring something about a call. Another followed moments later. Not together. Never together. Power didn't like to look obvious. Jonathan noticed the empty seats too late. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his tone still polished but thinner now. A woman across from him smiled, a careful, professional smile. "Of course," she said. "Just processing." Processing. Maya almost smiled. Behind the scenes, that word meant everything. Her phone vibrated again. This time, she allowed herself a glance. Incident verified, pattern confirmed, escalation authorized. Her pulse didn't spike. She'd known this was coming. Still, seeing it in writing carried weight. This wasn't about the spill anymore. It was about repetition. Jonathan leaned back, crossing his arms, trying to reclaim authority through posture. If there are concerns, now's the time to address them. Silence answered him. A thick, deliberate silence. Across the table, a senior investor set his napkin down carefully as if ending a meal that hadn't officially finished. "Jonathan," he said evenly, "I think we should pause." Pause. The word landed harder than any accusation. Jonathan frowned. "Pause what exactly?" The investor didn't answer immediately. He glanced down at his phone, then back up, measuring his words. "This conversation." A murmur rippled through the table. Not shock, but confirmation. The kind that comes when everyone already knows the truth and has been waiting for someone else to say it first. Jonathan straightened. "I don't understand." That was honest. He really didn't. Because men like Jonathan Prescott believe deals collapse because of numbers, not behavior. Because of markets, not moments. Because of weakness somewhere else, never in themselves. At the edge of the room, Maya watched the pieces move into place. This was the point of no return, the point where power no longer asked permission. The investor continued, his voice calm, professional. "There are standards attached to agreements of this scale, standards that go beyond performance metrics." Jonathan scoffed lightly. "We're talking about a minor misunderstanding with staff. Surely that doesn't—" "It's not minor," another voice cut in. Jonathan turned. The speaker was someone he hadn't paid much attention to all night. Quiet, observant, dangerous in ways Jonathan had underestimated. "It's documented," the man continued. "And it wasn't isolated." The word documented echoed in Jonathan's mind. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. Something cold settled in his chest. Maya felt it too, the moment when arrogance finally senses threat. Around the room, phones were no longer discreet. People weren't recording anymore. They were reading. Jonathan noticed the shift in their eyes, the way expressions changed not with emotion, but with information. "What exactly are you saying?" Jonathan asked. The investor stood. He didn't raise his voice. "Didn't need to." "I'm saying," he replied evenly, "that the behavior we witnessed tonight triggered a review." Jonathan laughed once, short, uncertain. "A review?" "Yes." The room held its breath. Maya tightened her grip slightly around the edge of her tray. This was it. Jonathan leaned forward. "You can't be serious. Over an accident? Over how you responded to it," the investor corrected. Silence again. The kind that didn't wait for answers. The kind that already had them. Maya looked at Jonathan Prescott for the first time, not as a server, not as an observer, but as a man standing on the edge of something collapsing. And he still didn't know how far the fall would be. Not yet. But he was about to. Jonathan Prescott felt the room closing in on him. Not physically. No one had moved closer, but in the way attention shifted. Eyes that once followed his gestures now avoided them. Faces that had nodded earlier were carefully blank. The confidence he'd worn like armor suddenly felt thin. "A review?" Jonathan repeated, forcing a chuckle that didn't convince even him. "Let's not be dramatic. This is a dinner, not a courtroom." The investor who had stood didn't sit back down. "That's exactly why it matters," he said calmly. He tapped his phone once, then set it on the table. Screen down. A deliberate move. A signal. Jonathan's jaw tightened. "I've closed deals 10 times this size. I've dealt with crises you couldn't imagine. You're telling me an accident with a server isn't the issue?" Another investor interrupted, her voice steady. "And you know that." Jonathan looked around, searching for an ally. He found none. Maya remained near the service station, her presence quiet, almost invisible. She wasn't meant to be part of this conversation. Not yet. But she listened as carefully as if her name were written into every sentence. Because it was. The standing investor folded his hands. "Jonathan, when firms commit $800 million, they're not just buying technology. They're buying leadership risk." Jonathan scoffed. "Leadership risk?" "Yes," the man replied. "The human kind." He paused, letting the words sink in. "There's a clause in the agreement," he continued. "One most executives never notice, because it's not about profit margins or exit strategies." Maya felt the air shift. This was the moment. "It's called a behavioral integrity clause," the investor said. Jonathan frowned. "I've reviewed every page of that contract." "I'm sure you have," the investor replied. "But clauses like this aren't written for attention. They're written for protection." Around the table, several people nodded. For the audience listening to this story, the investor went on, his tone now explanatory, almost instructional. A behavioral integrity clause exists for one reason: to identify leaders who become liabilities when they feel untouchable. Jonathan opened his mouth to interrupt. The investor raised a hand, not aggressively, just enough. "It's not triggered by mistakes," he said. "Accidents happen, spills happen, pressure happens." Maya's fingers tightened slightly. "It's triggered by patterns of behavior, public humiliation, demeaning language, abuse of power, especially toward people with less authority." Jonathan's chest tightened. "Why?" Jonathan asked, his voice sharper now. "Because feelings got hurt?" "No," the investor replied. "Because culture collapses faster than stock prices." He leaned forward slightly. "A CEO who humiliates in public will eventually destroy value in private. That's not theory. That's history." The room was silent. The investor continued, his voice steady, measured. "Under this clause, any verified incident of discriminatory or abusive conduct during negotiations triggers an immediate review." Jonathan felt heat rise in his face. "A review," he repeated, "which means discussion, context." "If the incident is unverified," the investor said. He tapped the table once. But tonight's was recorded, witnessed, time-stamped. Jonathan's breath caught. The clause doesn't pause the deal, the investor added. It doesn't renegotiate terms. It doesn't ask for apologies. Maya watched Jonathan's confidence fracture, just slightly. It terminates the agreement, the investor finished. Immediately. The word immediately landed like a verdict. Jonathan pushed his chair back an inch. This is absurd. You're talking about destroying months of work over who you showed yourself to be, another investor said quietly. Jonathan shook his head. You're making a moral judgment. Yes, the first investor replied. We are. The honesty stunned him. In deals of this scale, the investor continued, character is a financial metric. Maya felt something settle inside her. Not relief, not triumph, clarity. Jonathan leaned forward again, voice tight. So what? You're saying one sentence cost me $800 million? The investor met his eyes. No, Jonathan waited. I'm saying that sentence confirmed what the clause was designed to reveal. Around the table, phones buzzed again, not loudly but persistently. Notifications, updates, decisions moving without Jonathan's consent. Maya glanced at her phone. Review complete. Clause triggered. Execution approved. Her pulse remained steady. Jonathan noticed the expressions changing now, something final in them. You can't just, he began. The investor stood fully this time. We already have. He turned slightly, addressing the table. Effective immediately. The acquisition process is terminated. A chair scraped back, then another. The room didn't erupt. There was no shouting, no drama, just movement, people standing, jackets being adjusted, quiet murmurs as conversations shifted from possibility to aftermath. Jonathan Prescott sat frozen. $800 million. Gone. Maya remained where she was, her face calm, her posture unchanged. Jonathan finally looked at her again, not with anger this time, but with something closer to disbelief, like he was seeing her for the first time. He didn't know her name, didn't know her role, didn't know that the test he'd failed had never been about wine. It had been about restraint, and restraint was the one thing he'd never learned. As the room slowly emptied, Jonathan Prescott stayed seated, staring at a stain that could have been cleaned, if only he'd chosen dignity over dominance. But some stains didn't wash out. They spread. And this one had just reached everything he owned. Jonathan Prescott didn't stand when the others did. He watched chairs slide back, watched jackets lifted from backs, watched conversations splinter into hushed, urgent fragments. The room was emptying, not in a rush, not in chaos, but with purpose. That scared him more than shouting ever could. Deals didn't fall apart like this, not quietly, not cleanly. There were always negotiations, damage control, a window, something. This felt final. Wait, Jonathan said, finally pushing himself up. His voice cut through the low murmur, sharper than he intended. Let's not be hasty. No one turned around. A woman near the exit paused just long enough to say, "It's already done," without looking back. Jonathan stood there, hands planted on the edge of the table, breathing shallow. His mind raced through strategies the way it always had. Counteroffers, calls to make, favors to pull. He reached for his phone. 5 missed calls, 3 from board members, 2 from legal. His screen lit up again. Unknown number call incoming. Jonathan answered immediately. "I need you to stop this," he said, not bothering with greetings. "There's been a misunderstanding." Silence on the other end. Then, "Jonathan," a familiar voice said carefully, "we're in emergency session." His stomach dropped. "You're overreacting," Jonathan snapped. "This is optics. PR can handle optics." "Optics aren't the issue," the voice replied. "Governance is." Jonathan's grip tightened around the phone. You can't make decisions without me. We already have. The call ended. Jonathan stared at the screen, disbelief creeping in, thick and cold. Across the room, Maya moved again, not toward him, but past him. She carried a small tray, collecting unused dessert forks. The quiet efficiency of it felt surreal against the collapse unfolding inches away. Jonathan turned toward her, words spilling out before he could stop them. You. She paused, just long enough to face him. Her expression wasn't smug, wasn't victorious. It was calm. Yes, sir, she asked evenly. Jonathan swallowed. His anger had nowhere to go now. Do you have any idea what you just cost me? Maya held his gaze. Yes, she said simply. The word landed harder than any insult he'd thrown earlier. Jonathan scoffed weakly. You think this is some kind of lesson? Maya considered him, not as a billionaire, not as a CEO, but as a man unraveling in real time. I think, she said carefully, that it was always going to happen. Tonight just made it visible. Jonathan laughed once, hollow. You don't know how this world works. Maya didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. I know exactly how it works, she replied. That's why I'm here. Before Jonathan could respond, a sharp vibration rippled through the room, multiple phones lighting up at once. Screens flashed with headlines, forming faster than anyone could read them. Jonathan glanced at one over a shoulder. Breaking. 800 acquisition terminated. After incident at private investor dinner. His chest tightened. Another notification followed. Drake Systems stock down 11% in after-hours trading. Then another, board to review, CEO conduct, following viral video. Jonathan staggered back into his chair. Viral. The word echoed. He hadn't seen the video yet, but he didn't need to. He could already picture it. His voice, his face. The words replayed out of context and exactly as spoken. Crazy. Blind. You couldn't afford it. Across the ballroom, the hotel manager spoke quietly into a phone, his posture stiff. Security staff hovered near the exits, not for Jonathan, but to manage what came next. Maya's phone buzzed again. She didn't check it this time. She already knew. Jonathan looked up at her, desperation creeping into his expression. You think you've won? Maya shook her head slowly. This isn't about winning. Then what is it about? She met his eyes one last time. It's about what happens when people stop excusing behavior just because it comes with a title. Jonathan had no response. For the first time in his career, he had nothing to say that could fix this. Maya turned away and continued her work, disappearing once more into the flow of the room. To anyone watching, she was just a waitress finishing her shift. But Jonathan Prescott knew better now. Too late. As the ballroom lights dimmed and staff began resetting tables for an event that would never happen, Jonathan remained seated alone, surrounded by evidence of a life that had just cracked open. The deal was gone. The narrative had shifted. And the fall had only just begun, because tomorrow wouldn't bring explanations. It would bring consequences. The first headline hit before Jonathan Prescott made it to the elevator. He saw it reflected in the mirrored wall, someone else's phone glowing behind him, the words sharp and unmistakable even upside down. Billionaire CEO loses $800. Staur's deal after dinner incident. Jonathan's stomach twisted. By the time the elevator doors closed, 3 more notifications stacked beneath it. Different outlets, same tone, less patience. He jabbed the button for the lobby like it might move faster if he pressed harder. Inside the elevator, no one spoke. 2 junior executives stood beside him, eyes forward, shoulders stiff. 10 minutes ago, they would have laughed at his jokes, echoed his confidence, defended him reflexively. Now, they said nothing. That silence told him everything. His phone buzzed again. Board chair. Do not speak to press. We'll call you. Jonathan stared at the message, jaw tight. Do not speak. The words felt like a leash. The doors opened. The lobby was chaos disguised as calm. Security staff moved quickly but quietly. Hotel guests pretended not to stare while staring anyway. Someone near the entrance whispered his name, not in awe, but recognition. Jonathan adjusted his jacket, lifted his chin, and walked like a man who still believed posture could save. Him. Outside, cameras waited. Not a mob, just enough. Enough to make it real. "Mr. Prescott," a reporter called. "Can you comment on the incident tonight?" Jonathan kept walking. Another voice followed. "Is it true the deal was terminated on the spot?" Flashbulbs popped. Jonathan didn't stop until he reached the car. The door slammed shut behind him, sealing off the noise, but not the damage. Inside, he finally checked his phone. The video was everywhere, not edited, not exaggerated, just him, his voice, his words. "Are you crazy, girl? You couldn't afford it in your wildest dreams." Jonathan felt something close to panic rise in his chest. He'd always believed context mattered, that people would understand pressure, intent, hierarchy. But the internet didn't care about intent. It cared about moments. And this one was clean, ugly, and undeniable. At the same time, in a quiet hallway on the service level, Maya Thompson was clocking out. She removed her scarf slowly, folded it once, then again. Her hands moved with the same calm they had all night. Around her, other staff whispered, fragments of disbelief and excitement tangled together. "Did you see?" That was him, right? "They're saying the deal's gone." Maya didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her phone buzzed as she slipped it into her bag. Next, phase confirmed. "Meet tomorrow, 8:00 a.m. She paused for a moment, then typed back a single word. "Understood." Out in the city, Jonathan Prescott's night was unraveling faster by the minute. Sponsors were already distancing themselves. Partners issued statements filled with phrases like "deep concern" and "reviewing our relationship." One board member had stopped returning his calls entirely. By the time the car reached his penthouse, his company's stock had dropped another 6% in after-hours trading. Jonathan stood in his living room, city lights blazing beyond the glass, and felt something he hadn't felt in years: helplessness. He replayed the moment again and again in his mind. Not the spill, not the deal, but the look in the waitress's eyes. Not fear, not submission, certainty. That was what unsettled him most, because certainty meant intention, and intention meant this wasn't an accident. Across the city, Maya lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling. She thought about her younger self, the one who'd learned to stay quiet to survive. The one who'd believed invisibility was protection. Tonight had proven something else. Silence could be powerful, but so could being seen. Tomorrow she wouldn't wear a uniform. Tomorrow she wouldn't blend into the background. Tomorrow the story would add a name to the face everyone had already seen. And when it did, Jonathan Prescott would finally understand the part he'd missed. The waitress had never been powerless. She'd just been patient. Morning came without mercy. Jonathan Prescott woke to a phone that wouldn't stop. Vibrating. Not ringing, buzzing. Constant. Relentless. The kind of vibration that told him the world had moved on without waiting for him to catch up. He squinted at the screen. 37 notifications, 12 missed calls, 6 voicemails. Before he could open any of them, a news alert pushed to the top. Board of Directors to convene emergency meeting. CEO status under review. Jonathan sat up sharply, the city skyline still dark outside his penthouse windows. Under review. That phrase had never applied to him before. He was the one who reviewed others. The one who decided who stayed and who was replaced. He swung his legs out of bed and paced, running a hand through his hair. "This is temporary," he muttered to the empty room. "It has to be." But even as he said it, doubt crept in. He opened one voicemail. "Jonathan," the board chair said, voice measured but cold. "We need to talk about your conduct. Do not make public statements. Do not contact investors. We'll be in touch." The message ended without a goodbye. Jonathan felt his chest tighten. He opened another notification, this one from legal. Access to internal systems suspended pending review. Suspended. Jonathan stared at the word, his reflection faintly visible in the dark screen. For the first time since founding the company, he couldn't log into his own systems, couldn't see internal reports, couldn't issue directives. Power, it turned out, could vanish overnight. Across town, Maya Thompson stepped into a completely different morning. She stood outside a glass building she'd passed dozens of times without ever entering. The sign above the doors was understated. No logo, no slogan, just a name etched into steel. Inside of the air felt different, quieter, purposeful. A woman at the front desk smiled. "Ms. Thompson, they're expecting you." Maya nodded, her nerves steady but present. She wasn't wearing a uniform today. She wore a simple blazer, dark jeans, flats, nothing flashy, nothing to hide behind. She followed the woman down a hallway lined with framed mission statements and ethical charters, words like accountability, leadership, culture, printed in clean fonts. In a conference room at the end of the hall, a small group waited. "Good morning, Maya," one of them said. "Thank you for last night." Maya took a seat, folding her hands in her lap. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," she replied. "That's exactly the point," the man said. "You didn't provoke. You didn't escalate. You observed." He slid a tablet across the table. On it was a timeline, video clips, timestamps, notes. The spill, the outburst, the second comment, the pattern. "This is why behavioral integrity clauses exist," another woman said. "They protect organizations from leaders who think pressure excuses cruelty." Maya nodded slowly. "And from people who confuse authority with worth." A brief smile passed around the table. "Yes." "The woman agreed." "That too." Back in his penthouse, Jonathan Prescott watched his empire unravel in real time. Stock analysts debated his future on morning shows. Social media dissected his tone, his posture, his language. Former employees shared stories, quiet ones, long buried, that now felt safe to tell. Jonathan turned off the TV. He sat alone at his kitchen counter, staring at a cup of untouched coffee, and felt something unfamiliar settle in. Consequences. Not the kind that could be negotiated. Not the kind that could be delayed. The kind that arrived because people finally decided they'd seen enough. By noon, the board's decision was public. CEO Jonathan Prescott placed on indefinite leave. Jonathan read the headline twice. Indefinite. There would be no quick return. No apology tour big enough to erase what had happened. The stain wasn't on a tablecloth anymore. It was on his name. At the same hour, Maya stepped out of the building into sunlight that felt warmer than it had the day before. Her phone buzzed with a final message. Role confirmed. Full authority granted. She closed her eyes for a moment, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. The test was over. Not just Jonathan's, hers too. She'd entered the room invisible and left it changed, not by shouting, not by revenge, but by restraint. And as the city moved forward, two lives diverged in opposite directions, one defined by power finally questioned, the other by quiet strength finally recognized. Only one of them would be remembered for more than a single moment. And the world was already deciding which one mattered. The first time Maya Thompson saw her name in print, it wasn't in a headline. It was on a door, simple, clean, black letters on frosted glass. Maya Thompson, Director, Leadership, Risk, and Ethics. She stood there longer than necessary, not because she was unsure, but because she understood the weight of moments like this. Moments that looked quiet from the outside but carried years of pressure behind them. Just days earlier, she'd been standing in a uniform, absorbing words meant to shrink her. Now, she pushed the door open. Inside, the office was modest. No corner views, no excessive furniture. A desk, a chair, a wall of windows that let in honest light. On the desk sat a single folder, already open, filled with policies, procedures, and something new. Authority. Not borrowed, not symbolic. Real. Maya took a seat and let herself breathe. Across the city, Jonathan Prescott watched a different door close. Security escorted him from the building he'd once dominated. There were no cameras this time, no reporters, just the echo of footsteps and the hum of elevators that no longer answered to him. Employees avoided eye contact, not out of hatred but discomfort, the kind that comes when someone powerful falls and everyone realizes they'd been holding their breath for years. Jonathan paused in the lobby, staring at the company logo etched into stone. His name wasn't on it anymore. Not officially, not functionally. He walked out alone. That night, Maya addressed her team for the first time. She didn't raise her voice, didn't posture, didn't reference the viral video everyone already knew by heart. She spoke plainly. "There's a difference between authority and leadership," she said. "Authority can demand silence. Leadership earns trust." The room listened, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. She continued. "Behavioral integrity clauses don't exist to punish people for bad days. They exist to protect organizations from patterns that destroy culture quietly, long before profits fall." Heads nodded. "This isn't about catching someone at their worst," Maya said. "It's about noticing who they become when they think no one important is watching." The words lingered. Elsewhere, Jonathan scrolled through messages he could no longer answer. Sponsors had moved on. The board had issued a final statement. His name had become a case study, a cautionary footnote in leadership seminars and ethics panels. Not because he lost money, but because he failed a moment. Jonathan replayed it one last time in his head. Not the spill, not the deal, but the look in Maya's eyes. Not anger, not fear, awareness. He finally understood what had unsettled him. She hadn't been beneath him. She'd been measuring him. Weeks later, the story faded from trending lists. Another outrage replaced it. Another clip, another fall. But something had shifted beneath the noise. Companies revised contracts. Investors asked new questions. Boards paid closer attention, not to numbers alone, but to behavior. And Maya kept working, quietly, carefully, because real change didn't announce itself. It showed up in policies rewritten, in meetings interrupted, in leaders corrected before harm became habit. The night Jonathan Prescott lost $800 wasn't remembered because of the wine. It was remembered because power forgot something simple. That every room is a test, every interaction is a signal, and every person, especially the ones we overlook, might be holding the pen over our future. Maya closed her office door at the end of the day and turned off the light. Tomorrow, there would be another room, another test, another moment where someone would decide who they really were. And this time, more people would be watching.